my history as far as when I was growing up. My mother was Jehovah's Witness, and I spent my childhood most of the time under that particular faith and listening to the different teachings and beliefs that that they follow. And one day, around my teenage years, early teens, my mother just decided that we're not Jehovah's Witness anymore. She didn't explain to me why. She did later on in my life, but I'm not entirely sure if actually having been told when I was a kid why she stopped would have made much of a difference for the context of this discussion and the problems that it created for me. To spend so much time under a faith like Jehovah's Witness, where you're not allowed to celebrate birthdays or Christmas or say the Pledge of Allegiance in class amongst your social peers, and then have it all of a sudden just uprooted from you, like, oh, you can do those things now, is kind of a very mentally traumatic thing for a kid to have to go through. To have the rules just changed on you all of a sudden can be somewhat difficult. So that's what basically began my struggle to figure out, like, is there really a God? To have your faith just all of a sudden rearranged for you, just all of a sudden puts a critical eye on things automatically. So as I was growing up, I did believe there was a God. Didn't entirely know who he was, didn't necessarily see evidence for him, but was always told that he must exist, so therefore I must believe that there is one. I also didn't see any evidence for the non-existence of God. I would say that even as a self-proclaimed atheist, that I still don't see any evidence for the non-existence of God. If you were to technically talk about my beliefs, you would more appropriately say I'm agnostic. I do not know. And that is kind of the topic of this debate. Is there a God? Well, technically my real honest response to that is I don't know. However, if you don't have evidence to support the existence of something, why bother believing it exists? And I see in science that you can explain the existence of consciousness or the existence of life without the necessity of adding God into the picture. Science has shown very thoroughly that these things can exist naturally on their own without any sort of an orchestrator or agent guiding it. And there's lots of evidence to support that it obviously wasn't guided, that there were quote-unquote mistakes made along the line that had to be corrected as evolution took its course. Examples being the eye and how the photoreceptors in the retina are actually backwards, and that there's a blind spot in the middle of our retina. Why would that be there? Well, it's because in previous versions of an eye through evolution, these things were not necessarily a problem, but as new forms came up, these anomalies in the design, if you want to call it a design, were a little bit of a problem, but now we have what we like to call mental Photoshop that helps correct these things. And why would an all-powerful, all-knowing designer have made something that could have obviously been created in a much more intelligent way? Like the terminology of intelligent design really seems like a misnomer to me. It doesn't seem intelligent at all. It actually seems like a very unintelligent design. When you talk about like the evidence for evolution, I know that some people can take the evidence and say that it looks like that there was a designer, that the evidence does not prove anything. That is not entirely untrue. Nothing in science is actually proven except mathematics. There are very sound theories that are constantly evolving themselves as time goes on. Physics would be a primary example. We usually don't have anybody of a religious faith trying to disprove gravity or electromagnetics. It's almost always primarily cosmology or evolution, biological evolution to be more scientifically specific. Not that there's any real other type of scientific evolution. And physics used to be only classical Newtonian physics. There was just gravity, there was just maybe some electricity, And we thought we knew everything there was to know. We knew that if we threw a ball, we could calculate where it was going to land. We figured out airplanes, boats. We felt like we were really, really on top of things. Then all of a sudden they discovered quantum physics. Did that mean that all the physics before was wrong? No, not necessarily. In fact, most of that physics still applies quite thoroughly. But we still had to change the theory. That didn't mean that we had physics wrong. We just didn't have the whole picture. And we rewrote all the textbooks accordingly. And now we have something called modern physics. And 100 years from now, maybe there'll be a new modern physics. I don't like using that term as far as temporal relativity. I mean, it's always going to be modern. But quantum physics and general relativity didn't exist at one point. And we changed the theory. And the thing with evolutionary theory is that, at least as far as I can see, that the evidence that supports it is evidence that we find that we can verify to be factual and true, and then we create a theory around it. And if we find new evidence that contradicts it, we change the theory. So there's no sort of like concrete evolution is this and we're never going to alter what it means. It will be a constantly evolving theory itself. And so I find that people who want to believe beyond the shadow of a doubt that there is existence of a God tend to come at it from the approach from the presumption that God already exists, and now how do I explain the nature of the universe according to that assumption? And I believe that science comes from the approach that we will not allow any claims of anything supernatural, and we will only gather the facts as we see them in the physical universe that can be verified and tested, and then we create a theory afterwards. And I think that anybody that tries to say that evolution is a religion, well, I would say that that's false, because any particular religion that I can think of almost always never changes. It always has a doctrine that is almost never manipulated to whatever extent it can possibly be preserved, and it's not willing to change its initial presumptions of what was written at whatever particular time that it had been written. Science, on the other hand, will constantly update itself. And so there's not really that necessity to cherry pick. The fundamental thing is that I can see that we can explain the processes that go on in the universe as far as cosmology and planetary formation and star formation and destruction. We can explain the diversity of life through a naturalistic approach. And we can do this without saying that there has to be any sort of a supernatural being manipulating the process. Because if there was, lab experiments would never be consistent. If someone could just pray that something was to happen that we can show is not possible to happen, and then all of a sudden it affects physical reality, lab experiments should reflect this. Or they're just invalid. There would be no point to science. There would be no point to doing experiments if God could just change the rules at any time. So there has to be a set of natural rules, and that assumption has to be there in order for science itself to be valid. And most scientists, and I think even most religious people, would agree that in order for the things that they take for granted in the world that have been scientifically created or explained, that there has to be consistency. And I believe that the existence of a God is either unnecessary or would provide that inconsistency, and therefore invalidate everything.